When I first began teaching this class several years ago now, I made a very clear delineation between these tales, between myth and fairy tale in particular. But the more that I read and the more that I research about fairy tales in particular, the more that I have come to say that fairy tales are adaptations of myth in many circumstances, and fairy tales have become modern myths. Now, of course, this isn't a theory that I came up with. There are several books out on the market that support this. And so I shouldn't even say that I've become more to believe this, but I do think this from what it is that I have, again, read and studied. And two myth to fairy tales in particular that I can speak of are Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is a tale that I have talked about a couple of times. And Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who wrote a wonderful book called Women Who Run with the Wolves, discusses the tale of Little Red Riding Hood and how it is associated with a myth that I've also discussed quite a bit in this class. And I might have mentioned this before, but it bears mentioning again in more detail and more depth. Pinkola says that Little Red Riding Hood is Persephone, and there's a couple of reasons why she says that. For one thing, the color red. Red is the color of the pomegranate that Persephone in the original myth carried down into the underworld with her before there was a Hades, and she anointed the foreheads of the souls of the dead in order that they get some respite from their despairing situation. And then the other myth, the more classical myth with which that we are more familiar with, she eats the seeds of the pomegranate that keep her in the underworld with Hades for a part of the year. Now, of course, within Little Red Riding Hood, the most obvious red thing is her hood. She's not called Little Blue Hood, but why not? Well, I've also talked extensively this semester about the importance of blood, and as we all know, that when blood hits the air, it oxidizes and it turns red. I've discussed how red and in its association with blood is associated with death, and how the dead souls crave blood. And this is seen in the myth of Odysseus when he goes down into the underworld to get some information. He gives the shade blood in order to get that information, because those dead souls crave blood so much that they'll tell their secrets. Blood is also, I think, is the basis for the vampire myth, because the ancients understood very well blood is the life force. If you bleed too much, you die. And of course, in those days, they didn't have transfusions, but you already knew that. But blood is also important because it is an integral aspect of the menstrual cycle. And in the ancient days, the menstrual cycle would have been not the same way that we consider it either now or in the very recent past. With the advent of Judaism and Christianity, the whole menstrual cycle became a thing of shame. In Judaism, women had to go to a tent and stay when they were having their cycle because it was unclean. And likewise, the menstrual cycle became known as the curse, because within Christianity, many Christians considered that was one of the curses that Eve received for eating the apple or the fig or the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, was because of I'm sorry, I had to stop for a second because my cat just stole my hair tie and ran off with it. The fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Many people consider that a part of the curse that came from that was menstruation. And so women had many conflicting, emotions about that. Why is it important in the myth, in the fairy tale of Persephone and Little Red Riding Hood? Because these are young women. They stand on the cusp of between childhood and womanhood. And so the red is associated with the beginning of their cycle and becoming women, and could also reflect that emotional aspects. Much more so with Little Red Riding Hood in the confusion department than it would have been with Persephone. Now, it's not only the color red that Pinkola draws this correlation between these two girls, or very young women, but also flowers. And you think, what flowers? Well, remember back to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, in which Persephone is lured away from the safety of the crowd, the daughters of Oceanus, by the Narcissus. She leaves the safety of that group of girls in order to go after a flower, and that enables her uncle Hades to grab her and take her away into the underworld. What happens to Little Red Riding Hood? She leaves the safety of the path in order to hunt for flowers. And in some cases, it's just that she's not paying attention to what she's doing. And in other stories, it is because the wolf suggests it to her. So she is lured away into danger by going for flowers. Now, Pinkola also says that Little Red Riding Hood being swallowed by the wolf is akin to Persephone's descent into the underworld. And I don't quite buy into that, because in the original stories, and sometimes Little Red Riding Hood wasn't eaten by the wolf. In The Paths of Pins and Needles, she isn't, the story that I had you read. And also in very early stories, she was not rescued by the woodsman. And so if we were to take it from that point of view, she would have stayed in the underworld. But nevertheless, I do think that there are very clear correlations between those two young ladies.